Hello and welcome to my video, all about how to make a Mondrian inspired patchwork curtain. I came up with this project by first thinking how I could get a stained glass effect using a door curtain, which made me think of using organza fabric, and then I thought about the classic Mondrian pattern, which lends itself to patchwork techniques. I then stumbled on the traditional Korean patchwork technique of Bojagi, and all of that led to this project. Flat felled seams or Ssamsol seams are vital for this patchwork curtain because they enclose all of the raw edges, making a reversible seam that looks the same from both sides. In order to follow along, you will need these items. With regards to the fabric, I'm going to be using some organza, which is 100% polyester. You could instead use other lightweight fabrics, which would also be easier to work with. Organza looks nice, but is very thin and also bouncy, which makes seaming quite tricky. The colours I'm using are blue, white, yellow and red, and in hindsight I should have chosen a more vivid blue because the turquoise does look quite pale in the finished curtain. Okay, so the first step is to design the curtain. Obviously the size of the curtain will depend on the size of the doorway. I would recommend setting out to make the curtain a little bit bigger than the doorway, because it's easy to cut it down to size later on. I made a canvas in Photoshop the same proportions as my doorway, then planned out the design digitally and printed it out. If you don't have the software to do this, don't worry, you can always use a ruler and some coloured pencils instead. I split the curtain into blocks of 4 different colours and rearranged the blocks until it looked balanced. Keep in mind the patchwork process when doing this, as the more straight lines going fully across the curtain, the quicker and easier the project will be. Notice that I basically split the curtain into 3 main rectangles, and then split each of these rectangles into more blocks. More blocks equals more seams equals more time, so plan for your own patience levels. You'll need to work out the size of all of the blocks you're going to need, making sure to build in about ½ inch around the outside of the curtain for the hems, and 1 inch in total for each inner seam, i.e. the seams between the blocks. Also add extra at the bottom just in case, and extra at the top to wrap around the curtain pole. I labelled each block with a letter of the alphabet and the colour that block will be, and then I ticked these off as I cut them out. Note that if there are any major creases or wrinkles in your fabric, now will be the time to iron them, using appropriate heat settings for your fabric. Because organza is delicate and synthetic and can therefore melt, I used a piece of cotton in between the organza and the iron. Any pressing cloth will do. Just test the heat settings on a scrap of your fabric first as a test. Then measure and cut out all of the blocks of fabric you're going to need. Because the organza is very bouncy and difficult to keep still, I didn't mark the outline. Instead, I just used the markings of the cutting mat underneath, tried to make the organza as flat as possible, placed the ruler along the cut line, and used a rotary cutter to cut as straight as I could. If you're using an easier fabric like a lightweight cotton, you might want to mark out the measurements with a disappearing fabric marker first, then use a rotary cutter or fabric scissors to cut along the lines. Once I had them cut out, I labelled each block with a post-it note that stated the size and the corresponding letter of the alphabet, otherwise it will get very confusing very fast. Repeat the same for every block of fabric. We now need to sew together all of the blocks of fabric. As mentioned previously, my design splits into 3 large rectangles, which are each made up of at least 2 blocks. When joining the blocks together, I'm going to be working on 1 large rectangle at a time. Once those 3 large rectangles are made, I'll join them together to finish. For the seams, you can use flat felled seams, which I'll be demonstrating, or hand-sewn Ssamsol seams. And here should appear a link to a video about those seams. Just bear in mind that it will be very time consuming to sew the seams by hand. To begin, I'll sew together a yellow block and a white block. To do this, place the smaller block on top of the larger block and line up the edges you're going to join. Then offset the fabric block on top by 1/4 inch, i.e. in this case move it 1/4 inch to the left. Pin or clip the edges in place. Then sew 1/2 inch from the outer edge. In other words, 1/2 inch from the edge of the larger block. Because we're using a very thin fabric, it's best to use a fine sewing needle and short stitches. As you can see, I used a straight stitch. I also backstitched at the beginning and end. Once you've done that, open out the fabric like so. Next, fold the wider fabric edge over the narrower edge and push it over onto the side of the smaller block, in this case the yellow block. Then press this fold in place with an iron to help you with the sewing stage. Pin the fold in place. Then sew along the folded edge. When you're sewing, try and keep the line as straight as possible. You want it to be parallel to the previously sewn line. You should end up with a reversible seam with the raw edges completely enclosed. Then just carry on until you've sewn together all of the blocks. Obviously at some points you'll be joining rectangles together that are made up of multiple blocks. The only difference here is that you'll be incorporating the ends of previously sewn seams into the new seams. So in some places you'll be sewing through double the layers. But the fabric is so thin it doesn't really make too much difference. Just make sure as you go along that seams that are supposed to line up do. Once all of the blocks are joined, you'll need to hem all the way around. Before you do this, just check that the overall size of the curtain is what you want it to be, because if it isn't right, now is the time to trim it down to the correct dimensions. I folded each edge over by 1/4 inch twice, and then sewed the hem in place, i.e. I made a double fold hem. Lastly, get your curtain pole and place it across the top of the curtain. Fold the curtain over the pole and pin it in place to create a channel that the curtain pole can easily be slid into. Sew across the curtain to secure the channel. And that's it, the door curtain is now complete. Because the fabric is sheer and shiny, it's very difficult to film and photograph, so I hope you get the idea. It's very floaty and I really like the effect of the light coming through it. I really hope you enjoyed this video and thank you very much for watching.